In the dusty trading posts of the American frontier, human lives were bought and sold like cattle. But sometimes, fate has a twisted sense of humor. Sometimes, the very thing meant to destroy someone becomes the moment that changes two lives forever. This is the story of Sarah McKenna, a woman whose beauty was hidden behind a blindfold during the darkest moment of her life, and Running Wolf, a Comanche warrior whose heart was captured by what he couldn't see. When that blindfold finally came off, neither of them was prepared for what would happen next. This is a story about love, found in the most impossible places, courage born from desperation, and how sometimes the greatest acts of defiance come from the most unexpected sources. What you're about to hear isn't just another frontier tale, it's the true account of how a single moment of revealed truth brought a fierce warrior to his knees and changed the course of two very different worlds forever. Sarah McKenna had always been told she was too beautiful for her own good. Her mother used to say those words with a mixture of pride and worry, brushing Sarah's long golden hair while watching the horizon through their cabin window. Living on the edge of Texas territory in 1867, beauty could be both a blessing and a curse, and Sarah was about to discover just how true those words really were. The McKenna family had settled near the Brazos River, hoping to build a new life after the Civil War had torn their world apart. Sarah's father, Thomas, was a former Union soldier who had grown tired of fighting and wanted nothing more than to work the land in peace. Her mother, Elizabeth, had followed him west with their 3 children, carrying dreams of prosperity and safety. But safety was a rare commodity on the frontier, especially for a family with a daughter who turned heads wherever she went. Sarah was 18, with hair the color of prairie wheat, and eyes as blue as the Texas summer sky. She had inherited her mother's delicate features and her father's strong spirit. More than her beauty, it was her kindness that made her special. She helped neighboring families during difficult times, taught reading to the children of settlers who couldn't afford proper schooling, and had a way of making everyone around her feel at ease. In their small community of Riverdale, Sarah was beloved by all who knew her. The trouble started on a warm September morning when Sarah rode into town to pick up supplies from the general store. She often made this trip alone, despite her parents' growing concerns about the increasing reports of raids in the area. The Comanche had been growing bolder, striking settlements further and further east, as pressure from the expanding frontier pushed them from their traditional lands. But Sarah felt safe in the familiar routine of her weekly trips to town. As she loaded flour and sugar into her wagon, she noticed 3 men watching her from across the dusty main street. They weren't locals, that much was clear. Their clothes were too fine for honest frontier work, and they had the look of men who made their living in ways that didn't bear close examination. The tallest one, a man with a scarred face and cold grey eyes, seemed particularly interested in her. When their eyes met, he tipped his hat with a smile that made Sarah's skin crawl. She finished her business quickly and started the journey home, but the feeling of being watched never left her. The trail back to the McKenna homestead wound through a series of low hills and thick stands of oak and mesquite. It was beautiful country, but it also provided plenty of places for someone to hide and wait. About halfway home, as Sarah guided her wagon around a bend in the trail, 3 riders suddenly appeared in front of her, blocking her path. It was the same men from town, led by the scarred stranger who had been watching her so intently. His name, she would later learn, was Jake Morrison, and he made his living trafficking in human misery. He had been watching Sarah for weeks, waiting for the right opportunity to strike. To men like Morrison, a beautiful young woman represented a significant profit, especially if she could be sold to the right buyer. Sarah tried to turn her wagon around, but the other 2 men had already circled behind her, cutting off any escape. Morrison approached slowly, his horse's hooves raising small clouds of dust with each step. When he spoke, his voice was casual, almost friendly, as if he were discussing the weather rather than planning to destroy her life. Morrison explained his business proposition with the cold efficiency of a man who had done this many times before. Sarah would come with them willingly, or they would take her by force. Either way, she was leaving with them today. He had already found a buyer, a Comanche war chief named Iron Hawk, who was willing to pay handsomely for the right kind of captive. The chief had very specific requirements, and Sarah fit them perfectly. When Sarah refused and tried to fight, the outcome was inevitable. The 3 men were experienced in this terrible trade, and they knew exactly how to subdue their victims without causing damage that would reduce their value. They tied her hands and feet, gagged her to prevent her from crying out, and most importantly, they blindfolded her. The blindfold wasn't just to prevent her from seeing where they were taking her. Morrison had learned that many buyers preferred their human merchandise to remain mysterious until the final moment of sale. For 3 days, they traveled west into increasingly wild country. Sarah was kept blindfolded the entire time, fed only enough to keep her alive, and given water sparingly. The men spoke little during the journey, but when they did talk, it was about the money they would make from this sale and about other victims they had sold in the past. Sarah began to understand that she had fallen into the hands of men who made their living by stealing human beings and selling them like livestock. The landscape changed as they traveled deeper into Comanche territory. The settled farmlands gave way to rolling hills covered with buffalo grass and mesquite. The air grew drier and the nights became colder. Sarah could hear the calls of coyotes in the distance and the endless whisper of wind through the grass. Even blindfolded, she could sense that she was being taken far from everything she had ever known. On the morning of the fourth day, Sarah heard voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize. Through her blindfold, she could see the dim glow of fires and could smell wood smoke and cooking meat. The sounds were different too, horses neighing, dogs barking, and the voices of many people going about their daily business. She had been brought to a Comanche village, and her fate was about to be decided by forces completely beyond her control. Morrison and his men had arrived at the camp of Chief Ironhawk, a war leader known throughout the region for his fierce resistance to white settlement. Ironhawk was a practical man who understood that the old ways were disappearing, but he was determined to maintain his people's strength and independence for as long as possible. He had learned that taking captives could serve multiple purposes. They could be used for labor, traded for supplies, or held for ransom. When Morrison had approached him weeks earlier with the proposition to acquire a specific type of captive, Ironhawk had agreed to consider the offer. The chief had very particular requirements. He wanted someone young and strong enough to work, but also someone whose capture would send a message to the white settlers who continued to encroach on tribal lands. Most importantly, he wanted someone who could serve as a symbol of his power and defiance. Morrison had assured him that Sarah McKenna would meet all of these requirements perfectly. As Sarah was roughly pulled from her horse, still blindfolded and bound, she could hear the negotiations beginning around her. Morrison was speaking with someone in broken Spanish mixed with English, describing his merchandise like a horse trader at a frontier market. She heard numbers being discussed, could sense people moving around her, examining her as if she were indeed a piece of livestock, being evaluated for purchase. The moment that would change everything was approaching, though neither Sarah nor anyone else in that Comanche camp could have predicted what was about to happen. Running Wolf, Ironhawk's youngest war chief and most trusted advisor, had been away on a scouting mission when Morrison arrived. He was just returning to camp as the final negotiations were taking place. Running Wolf was 25 years old, considered young for his position but respected for his wisdom and courage in battle. He had earned his name during a famous raid where he had run for 12 miles to warn his people of approaching cavalry, saving dozens of lives in the process. Unlike many of the older warriors, he had learned to read and write English from a captured schoolteacher years earlier, and he often served as a translator and negotiator for his chief. As he approached the center of camp where the crowd had gathered, Running Wolf felt a strange sense of unease. Something about this situation felt different from the usual business of trading and warfare. When he saw Morrison and his men, he immediately disliked what he observed. There was something cruel and predatory about these white men that went beyond the normal tensions between their peoples. This wasn't warfare or even honest conflict. This was something darker. Ironhawk called Running Wolf forward to witness the completion of the transaction. The chief wanted his most trusted advisor to evaluate this purchase and to serve as translator if needed. As Running Wolf approached the bound and blindfolded woman standing in the center of the circle, he felt that strange unease growing stronger. Something about this moment felt significant in a way he couldn't explain. Morrison was growing impatient to complete the deal and collect his payment. He had other business to attend to, and staying in Comanche territory longer than necessary was always dangerous, even for someone with his experience. He began to push for the final moment of the transaction. The moment when the blindfold would be removed and the merchandise would be fully revealed. The crowd of warriors and their families had grown larger as word spread through the camp. It wasn't often that outsiders brought captives to trade, and everyone was curious to see what Ironhawk had purchased. Children peered between the legs of adults, women whispered among themselves, and the warriors watched with the calculating eyes of men who understood the value of human life in terms of warfare and survival. As Morrison reached for the blindfold, preparing to complete the sale, Running Wolf stepped closer. He told himself he was merely doing his duty as Ironhawk's advisor, but something deeper was driving him forward. In a few seconds, everything would be revealed, and nothing would ever be the same again for any of them. The blindfold was tied tightly, knotted with the casual cruelty of men who had done this many times before. Sarah's golden hair had been tucked underneath the rough cloth, and her face was streaked with dust from the long journey. She stood as straight as her bonds would allow, refusing to show the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Even in this desperate situation, her inner strength shone through. Morrison's rough fingers worked at the knot, and Running Wolf found himself holding his breath, without knowing why. The moment stretched out, filled with the crackling of fires, the shuffle of feet in dust, and the sound of Sarah's rapid breathing. In a few heartbeats, the blindfold would fall away, and everyone present would see the face that had started this entire chain of events. When the blindfold finally came loose and fell to the ground, Running Wolf felt as if the earth had shifted beneath his feet. Sarah McKenna stood revealed in the afternoon sunlight, and she was unlike anything he had ever seen or imagined. But it wasn't just her beauty that struck him like a physical blow, it was the look in her eyes, the unmistakable spirit that no amount of brutality had been able to break. In that moment, Running Wolf knew that his life had just changed forever, though he had no idea how or why. The moment Sarah's blindfold fell away, a silence descended over the Comanche camp that seemed to stretch into eternity. Her golden hair caught the afternoon sunlight like spun silk, and her blue eyes blazed with a defiance that had survived 3 days of terror and uncertainty. She stood there, bound and frightened but unbroken, and every person in that circle felt the power of her presence. But no one felt it more powerfully than Running Wolf. As their eyes met for the first time, something fundamental shifted in his understanding of the world. He had expected to see another broken captive, another victim of the endless conflict between their peoples. Instead, he found himself looking into the face of someone whose spirit seemed to shine from within, whose courage in the face of impossible circumstances spoke to something deep in his own soul. Running Wolf had seen many captives over the years. Some were defiant, some were broken, some were angry, and some were resigned to their fate. But he had never seen anyone who seemed to look directly into his heart the way Sarah McKenna was looking at him now. In that moment, he felt as if she could see past all his armor, both literal and metaphorical, and glimpse the man he truly was beneath the warrior's facade.
For Sarah, the removal of the blindfold brought a rush of sensory overload after days of darkness.
The bright sunlight made her squint, and the sight of dozens of Comanche warriors surrounding her should have filled her with terror. But instead, her attention was immediately captured by the young man standing directly in front of her. He was tall and lean, with long black hair and dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of intelligence and compassion she hadn't expected to find in this place. There was something in Running Wolf's expression that was completely different from the cold calculation she had seen in Morrison's eyes, or the indifferent cruelty of his companions. This man was looking at her as if he truly saw her, not just as a commodity or a symbol, but as a human being worthy of recognition and respect. It was a look she hadn't expected to receive ever again. The silence stretched on for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. The other members of the camp began to shift restlessly, unsure of what was happening or why their war chief's advisor seemed so stunned by the sight of the captive. Ironhawk himself was watching the exchange with growing puzzlement, wondering why Running Wolf appeared to be frozen in place. Morrison was the first to break the strange spell that had settled over the group. He stepped forward with his usual crude directness, eager to complete the transaction and collect his payment. He gestured towards Sarah, as if she were a prize horse he was presenting for sale. Launching into a detailed description of her qualities and potential value, he spoke of her youth, her obvious good health, her apparent intelligence, and most importantly, her striking beauty that would make her a valuable addition to any chief's household. But Running Wolf barely heard Morrison's sales pitch. He was still locked in that moment of recognition with Sarah, still trying to understand what was happening to him. In his 25 years of life, he had never experienced anything like the jolt of connection he felt when their eyes met. It was as if he had been struck by lightning or touched by the spirit world in some profound way. As Morrison continued his crude presentation, Running Wolf became aware of something that troubled him deeply. The white trader was speaking about Sarah as if she were property to be owned, rather than a person with her own thoughts, feelings, and dreams. This bothered Running Wolf more than it should have, and he found himself growing angry in a way that surprised him. Ironhawk stepped forward to examine his potential purchase more closely. The chief was a practical man who approached such transactions with the cold calculation of someone who understood the harsh realities of frontier life. He walked around Sarah slowly, evaluating her as he would a horse or a weapon, considering how she might serve his purposes and strengthen his position. As Iron Hawk conducted his examination, Running Wolf found himself growing more uncomfortable with each passing moment. He tried to tell himself that this was simply the way such things were done, that captives had been taken and traded for as long as anyone could remember. But something about watching Sarah being evaluated like livestock filled him with a rage that he didn't fully understand. Sarah herself stood as straight as her bonds would allow, meeting Iron Hawk's gaze with the same defiant courage she had shown throughout her ordeal. She didn't speak, but her eyes communicated clearly that while these men might be able to control her body, they would never break her spirit. This inner strength was evident to everyone present, but it seemed to affect Running Wolf more powerfully than anyone else. When Iron Hawk had completed his examination, he began the final negotiations with Morrison. The price had already been generally agreed upon, but there were details to work out regarding payment and timing. Morrison wanted his money immediately, while Iron Hawk preferred to complete such transactions more gradually, as was traditional in his culture. As the two men haggled over terms, Running Wolf found himself moving closer to Sarah. He told himself he was simply doing his job as Iron Hawk's translator and advisor, but the truth was more complicated. He felt drawn to her in a way that defied explanation, compelled to offer some kind of comfort or reassurance in what had to be the most terrifying moment of her life. When he was close enough to speak to her without being overheard, Running Wolf did something that surprised himself. Speaking in carefully pronounced English, he whispered words of encouragement that he had no business offering to a captive his chief was in the process of purchasing. He told her that she was strong, that she would survive this trial, that things might not be as hopeless as they seemed. Sarah was startled to hear English spoken by one of her captors, and even more surprised by the kindness in Running Wolf's voice. She looked into his eyes again, searching for any sign of deception or cruelty, but found only what appeared to be genuine compassion. It was the first kindness she had received since her capture, and it affected her more powerfully than she expected. The negotiations between Iron Hawk and Morrison were reaching their conclusion. The chief was satisfied with what he was purchasing, and Morrison was eager to collect his payment and leave Comanche territory before his luck ran out. But as they prepared to finalize the deal, Running Wolf did something that shocked everyone present, including himself. He stepped forward and addressed Iron Hawk directly, speaking in their own language with the formal respect due to a chief, but also with the confidence of a trusted advisor. What he said sent ripples of surprise through the watching crowd and brought the negotiations to an immediate halt. Running Wolf told his chief that he wished to make a counterproposal regarding the captive. Instead of having her serve in Iron Hawk's household as originally planned, Running Wolf requested permission to take responsibility for her himself. He offered to pay Iron Hawk the full amount the chief was paying Morrison, plus an additional sum, in exchange for the right to determine Sarah's fate personally. The request was unprecedented. War chiefs did not typically purchase captives for their personal use, especially not captives they had no previous connection to. Iron Hawk stared at his young advisor in amazement, trying to understand what could have motivated such an extraordinary request. The watching crowd murmured among themselves, equally puzzled by this unexpected development. Morrison was becoming increasingly agitated, as his carefully planned transaction threatened to become complicated. He had other business to attend to and couldn't afford to spend additional time in Comanche territory while they worked out their internal politics. He demanded that the original deal be honored immediately, threatening to take his merchandise elsewhere if there were going to be complications. Iron Hawk found himself in an unusual position. On one hand, he had already agreed to the terms with Morrison and was honor-bound to complete the transaction as planned. On the other hand, Running Wolf was his most trusted advisor and had never before made such a personal request. The chief needed time to consider the implications of this unexpected development. As the three men debated the situation, Sarah found herself at the center of a negotiation that would determine the course of her life, yet she had no voice in the discussion. She understood enough of what was happening to realize that the young warrior who had spoken kindly to her was somehow trying to intervene on her behalf, though she couldn't understand why or what it might mean for her future. The tension in the camp was building as more and more people became aware of the unusual situation developing around the captive trade. Such transactions were normally straightforward affairs, but this one had become complicated in ways that no one had anticipated. Warriors began taking sides. Some supporting Iron Hawk's right to conduct business as he saw fit, others intrigued by Running Wolf's unprecedented request. Finally, Ironhawk made a decision that reflected both his wisdom as a leader and his respect for Running Wolf's judgment. He proposed a compromise that would satisfy Morrison's need for immediate payment while giving Running Wolf the opportunity to make his case. Ironhawk would purchase the captive as originally planned, but he would give Running Wolf 3 days to present his arguments for taking responsibility for her. During those 3 days, Sarah would remain in the camp under guard, but she would be treated as a guest rather than a captive. If Running Wolf could convince Ironhawk that his proposal served the tribe's interests better than the original plan, the chief would consider transferring responsibility for Sarah to his young advisor. If not, the original arrangement would go forward. Morrison was not pleased with this compromise, but he recognized that he had little choice in the matter. He was in Comanche territory, outnumbered and dependent on Ironhawk's goodwill for his safe passage out of the area. He accepted the payment for Sarah and prepared to leave, warning Ironhawk that he expected their future business relationship to proceed more smoothly. As Morrison and his men rode away from the camp, Sarah found herself in a completely new situation. She was still a captive, still far from home with no clear path to freedom. But something fundamental had changed. The young warrior named Running Wolf had intervened on her behalf, though she still didn't understand his motivations or what it might mean for her future. Running Wolf himself was struggling to understand what he had just committed himself to. He had 3 days to convince his chief that taking responsibility for this white woman served the tribe's interests, but he wasn't entirely sure he could explain his own motivations, let alone make a convincing argument to Ironhawk. What he did know was that the moment Sarah's blindfold had fallen away, something had awakened in him that he had never experienced before. Whether it was love, compassion, or simply recognition of a kindred spirit, he felt compelled to protect her in a way that went far beyond duty or tribal politics. The next 3 days would determine whether that commitment would be enough to change both of their lives forever. The 3 days that followed Morrison's departure were unlike anything Sarah McKenna had ever experienced. She found herself in a strange liminal space, no longer bound and blindfolded like a captive, but not yet free to determine her own fate. She had been given a small teepee at the edge of the camp, with 2 young women assigned to watch over her and ensure she didn't attempt to escape. But more than guards, her watchers seemed genuinely curious about this white woman, who had somehow captured the attention of their most respected war chief. Running Wolf spent those 3 days in a state of constant motion, wrestling with emotions and ideas that challenged everything he thought he knew about himself and his world. During the day, he went about his normal duties, leading scouting parties, meeting with Ironhawk about tribal business, and maintaining the routine that kept the camp functioning smoothly. But every spare moment was spent thinking about Sarah and trying to formulate arguments that might convince his chief to grant his unprecedented request. The challenge facing Running Wolf was more complex than simply asking for permission to take responsibility for a captive. He needed to explain to Ironhawk why doing so would serve the tribe's interests better than the original plan. Ironhawk was a practical leader who made decisions based on what was best for his people, not on personal whims or individual desires. Running Wolf would need to present a compelling case that went beyond his own inexplicable attraction to this white woman. Sarah herself was struggling to understand the cultural dynamics at play around her. The 2 women assigned to watch her, whose names she learned were Singing Bird and Doe Eyes, spoke some English and gradually began to explain what was happening. Through their broken but earnest attempts at communication, Sarah began to understand that Running Wolf was considered one of the most honorable men in the tribe, someone whose judgment Ironhawk trusted completely. His intervention on her behalf was seen as highly unusual, but not without precedent in the complex world of Comanche politics. As the first day passed, Sarah found herself thinking constantly about the moment when Running Wolf had whispered words of encouragement to her. There had been something in his voice, a warmth and sincerity that seemed genuine even in the midst of her terrifying circumstances. She tried to tell herself not to read too much into a simple act of kindness, but she couldn't forget the way he had looked at her, as if he truly saw her as a person rather than a prize to be won or owned. Running Wolf's first approach to convincing Ironhawk was based on practical considerations. He argued that having a white captive who could read, write, and speak English fluently would be valuable to the tribe in their ongoing negotiations with government officials and army representatives. Sarah's education and intelligence could serve as diplomatic assets, helping the tribe navigate the increasingly complex relationship with the advancing white settlement. But Ironhawk was not easily convinced by this line of reasoning. The chief pointed out that they already had access to interpreters and translators when needed, and that keeping a white captive for such purposes might create more problems than it solved. If Sarah's family or the authorities discovered her location, it could bring unwanted military attention to the camp. The practical value of her language skills had to be weighed against the potential risks of keeping her. During the second day, Running Wolf tried a different approach. He spoke to Iron Hawk about the changing nature of the conflict between their peoples and the need for the tribe to understand their enemies better. Having someone who could explain white customs, thinking, and motivations might provide strategic advantages in future conflicts. Sarah's presence in the camp could serve as a window into the white world, helping them predict and prepare for future challenges. This argument carried more weight with Iron Hawk, who was always thinking about the long-term survival of his people in the face of overwhelming odds. But the chief also recognized the emotional undertones in Running Wolf's advocacy. He had known his young advisor since childhood, and had never seen him so passionate about any issue that didn't directly relate to warfare or tribal survival. Iron Hawk began to suspect that Running Wolf's motivations were more complex than simple strategic thinking. Sarah spent her second day learning more about life in the Comanche camp through her conversations with Singing Bird and Doe Eyes. She discovered that these people, whom she had been taught to think of as savage enemies, had rich cultural traditions, complex family relationships, and deep spiritual beliefs. The women told her stories about Running Wolf's reputation as a warrior and leader, describing how he had earned the respect of everyone in the tribe through his courage, wisdom, and unwavering loyalty to his people.
The more Sarah learnt about Running Wolf, the more puzzled she became by his intervention on her behalf.
According to Singing Bird and Doe Eyes, he had never shown particular interest in any woman, white or Comanche.
He was considered one of the most eligible men in the tribe, but he had always seemed more focused on his responsibilities as a war chief than on personal relationships. His sudden interest in protecting a white captive was as mysterious to them as it was to Sarah herself. As the second evening approached, Running Wolf realized that his practical arguments weren't going to be sufficient to convince Iron Hawk. The chief was too wise and too experienced to be swayed by strategic considerations alone, especially when those considerations didn't clearly outweigh the risks involved. Running Wolf would need to be more honest about his motivations if he hoped to succeed, even if that meant revealing feelings he didn't fully understand himself. That evening, Running Wolf requested a private meeting with Iron Hawk in the chief's lodge. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of Running Wolf's life, requiring him to speak openly about emotions and experiences that challenged his understanding of himself and his role in the tribe. Running Wolf began by acknowledging that his arguments about strategic and diplomatic value, while genuine, were not his primary motivations for wanting to protect Sarah. He told Iron Hawk about the moment when her blindfold had been removed and the inexplicable connection he had felt. He described it not as simple attraction or desire, but as a recognition of something deeper, a sense that their meeting was somehow significant in ways that went beyond immediate circumstances. Iron Hawk listened to his young advisor's confession with the patient attention of a man who had seen many strange things during his long life. He had witnessed the power of visions and spiritual experiences, and he understood that sometimes the spirits moved in ways that defied ordinary understanding. But he also had a responsibility to his people that superseded any individual's personal experiences, no matter how profound they might seem. The chief asked Running Wolf directly whether he believed the spirits were speaking to him through his encounter with this white woman. This was a question that Running Wolf had been wrestling with since the moment he first saw Sarah, and he answered with the honesty that had always characterized his relationship with Iron Hawk. He said he didn't know whether the spirits were involved, but he felt certain that protecting Sarah was something he was meant to do, even if he couldn't explain why. Iron Hawk's response surprised Running Wolf. Instead of dismissing his young advisor's feelings as foolish or irrelevant, the chief shared his own observations about the unusual nature of the situation. He had noticed the way the entire camp had reacted to Sarah's presence, the sense that something significant was happening that went beyond the normal dynamics of captive taking. He had also observed Running Wolf's behavior over the past 2 days and recognized the signs of a man wrestling with forces beyond his control. But Iron Hawk also shared his concerns about the implications of Running Wolf's request. If the young war chief took responsibility for Sarah, he would be creating a situation with no clear precedent in tribal custom. The other warriors might question his judgment or his loyalty to the tribe. The white woman's presence might create internal conflicts that could weaken the group's unity at a time when they needed to remain strong in the face of external threats. The conversation continued late into the night, covering topics that ranged from practical politics to spiritual philosophy. Iron Hawk wanted to understand not just what Running Wolf was asking for, but what he was prepared to do with the responsibility he was requesting. If Sarah became his ward, what would her role be in the tribe? How would he handle the inevitable conflicts that would arise from harboring a white captive? What would he do if her presence ultimately proved harmful to tribal unity or safety? Running Wolf answered these questions as honestly as he could, acknowledging that he didn't have all the answers, but expressing his willingness to accept full responsibility for whatever consequences might arise from his decision. He promised that if Sarah's presence proved harmful to the tribe, he would personally ensure that the situation was resolved in whatever way Ironhawk deemed necessary. As the third day dawned, both Running Wolf and Sarah found themselves facing the reality that their fates would soon be decided by forces beyond their control. Running Wolf had presented his case as persuasively as he could, but the decision ultimately rested with Ironhawk. Sarah had spent 3 days learning about a culture she had never tried to understand before, and she found herself hoping for an outcome she couldn't have imagined wanting just a few days earlier. The decision, when it finally came, reflected Ironhawk's wisdom as a leader and his deep understanding of human nature. Rather than simply granting or denying Running Wolf's request, the chief proposed a trial period that would allow everyone involved to test the viability of the arrangement while minimizing the risks to tribal unity and security. Ironhawk announced that he would grant Running Wolf's request for a period of 1 full season. During that time, Sarah would remain in the camp under Running Wolf's protection and guidance, but she would be expected to contribute to the community's welfare through whatever skills and abilities she possessed. At the end of the season, Ironhawk would evaluate the arrangement based on its effects on tribal harmony, Sarah's integration into the community, and the overall benefits or detriments of her presence. The conditions Ironhawk established were specific and non-negotiable. Sarah would be free to move about the camp during daylight hours, but would remain under constant supervision. She would be expected to learn Comanche customs and language, to respect tribal traditions, and to make herself useful through whatever work she was capable of performing. Most importantly, any problems arising from her presence would be Running Wolf's responsibility to resolve. For Sarah, the chief's decision represented a reprieve from immediate danger, but also the beginning of a completely new chapter in her life. She would have a chance to prove herself worthy of the protection Running Wolf had offered, but she would also be living in a world whose rules and expectations were completely foreign to her experience. Everything she did during the coming months would be scrutinized for evidence of whether a white woman could truly find a place within a Comanche community. Running Wolf received the news of Ironhawk's decision with a mixture of relief and trepidation. He had succeeded in gaining the opportunity he had requested, but he also understood that he had taken on a responsibility unlike any he had ever faced. The next few months would test not only Sarah's ability to adapt to life in the tribe, but also his own wisdom in making such an unprecedented request. As the third day ended and the trial period officially began, both Sarah and Running Wolf found themselves embarking on a journey that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves, their cultures, and the possibilities for understanding between two very different worlds. Neither of them could predict what the coming season would bring, but both were committed to discovering what might be possible when two people from opposite sides of an ancient conflict choose to see each other as human beings rather than enemies. The season that followed Ironhawk's decision transformed both Sarah McKenna and Running Wolf in ways neither of them could have anticipated. What began as a desperate attempt to save a life gradually evolved into something far more complex and profound, a journey of mutual discovery that challenged every assumption both had held about their respective worlds. Sarah's introduction to Comanche daily life was both easier and more difficult than she had expected. The physical demands were challenging for someone raised in the relative comfort of a frontier homestead, but the rhythms of camp life had their own logic that she gradually began to understand. Women rose before dawn to tend fires and prepare food, spent their days in constant activity ranging from hide preparation to childcare, and often worked well into the evening hours maintaining the countless tasks that kept the community functioning. Singing Bird and Doe Eyes became more than guards during those early weeks. They became Sarah's guides into a world of customs and expectations that seemed alien at first but gradually revealed their underlying wisdom. They taught her how to prepare traditional foods, how to tan hides properly, how to maintain and repair the essential tools of daily life, and most importantly, how to navigate the complex social relationships that governed every aspect of camp interaction. The language barrier proved to be both a challenge and an unexpected bridge. Sarah's determination to learn Comanche impressed the women of the tribe, who had expected a white captive to remain stubbornly attached to her own ways. Her willingness to struggle with unfamiliar sounds and grammatical structures demonstrated a respect for their culture that gradually earned their acceptance. In return, several of the women worked to improve their own English, creating moments of shared laughter over mutual linguistic mistakes that broke down barriers of suspicion and fear. Running Wolf found his own role evolving in unexpected ways as Sarah's protector and guide. Initially, he had focused on ensuring her physical safety and helping her understand the basic rules of camp life. But as the days passed, he discovered that their relationship was becoming something far more complex than a simple arrangement of protection and guidance. They began to have conversations that ranged far beyond practical necessities, exploring differences and similarities between their cultures, sharing stories from their respective pasts, and gradually developing the kind of mutual understanding that forms the foundation of genuine friendship. These conversations often took place in the evening hours, when the day's work was done and the camp had settled into the peaceful rhythms of family time. Running Wolf would sit outside Sarah's lodge, maintaining the proper distance required by tribal customs, while they talked about everything from childhood memories to philosophical questions about the nature of justice and conflict. Sarah was surprised to discover that this Comanche warrior possessed a keen intelligence and a thoughtful nature that challenged every stereotype she had been taught about his people. Running Wolf, for his part, was equally surprised by Sarah's depth of character and understanding. He had expected to find a typical example of white civilization, pampered, narrow-minded, and unable to adapt to circumstances different from those she had known. Instead, he discovered a woman of remarkable resilience and empathy, someone capable of seeing beyond surface differences to recognize the fundamental humanity they shared. As the weeks passed, Sarah's integration into camp life progressed more smoothly than anyone had predicted. Her medical knowledge, gained from helping her mother tend sick neighbors back in Texas, proved valuable when several children fell ill with fever. Her ability to read and write became useful when the tribe needed to decipher written communications from military officials. Most importantly, her willingness to work alongside the other women without complaint or condescension gradually earned her a place in the community's daily rhythms. The seasonal progression brought changes that tested everyone's adaptability. As autumn deepened into winter, the tribe began its traditional preparations for the harsh months ahead. Sarah learned to help with the complex process of preserving meat, preparing winter clothing, and winterizing the lodges that would provide shelter during the coldest months. These activities required skills she had never developed in her previous life, but her determination to contribute meaningfully to the community's welfare drove her to master them quickly. Running Wolf watched Sarah's transformation with growing admiration and something deeper that he was still reluctant to name. The frightened captive who had stood blindfolded in the camp circle months earlier had evolved into a capable and respected member of the community. She had retained her essential character, the inner strength and compassion that had first drawn his attention, but she had also developed new skills and understanding that allowed her to function effectively in a world completely different from the one she had known. The winter months brought their own challenges and revelations. Confined to close quarters by harsh weather, the members of the camp spent long hours in shared activities that required cooperation and patience. Sarah found herself included in the women's winter gatherings, where stories were told, crafts were practiced, and the accumulated wisdom of generations was passed down through informal conversation. Her presence in these intimate settings marked her full acceptance into the community's inner circles. During these winter evenings, Sarah heard stories that completely changed her understanding of the conflict between Comanche people and white settlers. She learned about broken treaties, about promised goods that never arrived, about peaceful tribes that had been attacked without provocation. She began to understand that the raids and warfare she had been taught to see as unprovoked savagery were often desperate responses to systematic betrayal and injustice. Running Wolf, meanwhile, was learning equally important lessons about the white world through his conversations with Sarah. She told him about families like her own who had come west seeking only the chance to build peaceful lives, about communities that wanted nothing more than to raise their children in safety and prosperity. She helped him understand that not all white people were motivated by greed or hatred, that many were simply trying to survive and build better lives for their families. These mutual revelations created a foundation of understanding that went far beyond the personal connection between Sarah and Running Wolf. They began to envision possibilities for coexistence that neither had imagined before, ways that their two peoples might find common ground instead of endless conflict. Their conversations became explorations of what peace might look like and what would be required to achieve it. Spring's arrival brought new developments that would test the progress they had made during the long winter months. Messengers arrived with news that military forces were planning increased operations against Comanche bands throughout the region. The peaceful winter interlude was ending, and the camp would soon need to make decisions about how to respond to external pressures that threatened their continued independence. Iron Hawk called a council to discuss the tribe's options in the face of these new threats. For the first time since her arrival, Sarah was invited to attend, her presence acknowledged as that of someone whose insights might be valuable in planning their response. Her inclusion in this important gathering marked the completion of her transformation from captive to trusted community member.
During the council, Sarah was asked to share her understanding of military tactics and government policies that might affect the tribe's future. Her knowledge of white culture and thinking proved valuable in helping the warriors understand what they might expect from upcoming military campaigns.
But more importantly, her perspective as someone who had come to understand both worlds allowed her to suggest possibilities for negotiation and compromise that might not have occurred to others. Running Wolf watched Sarah's participation in the council with pride and something approaching awe. The woman who had once stood bound and blindfolded in this very spot was now offering counsel to war chiefs and respected elders. Her transformation had been complete, but it had also been mutual. He realized that he too had been changed by their months of interaction, that his understanding of himself, his people, and the world around him had been fundamentally altered by their relationship. As the council ended and the tribe began preparing for whatever challenges the coming months might bring, both Sarah and Running Wolf understood that they had reached a turning point. The trial period Iron Hawk had established was drawing to a close, and decisions would need to be made about Sarah's permanent status in the community. But more than administrative arrangements, they were facing questions about the nature of their relationship and what it might mean for both their futures. The conversation they had that evening was different from all the others that had preceded it. For the first time, they spoke directly about the feelings that had been developing between them over the long months of shared experience. Running Wolf finally acknowledged the depth of his attraction to Sarah, his growing conviction that their meeting had been guided by forces beyond mere chance. Sarah admitted that her feelings for him had evolved far beyond gratitude for his protection, that she had come to respect and care for him in ways that challenged everything she had been taught about the boundaries between their peoples. But they also spoke honestly about the obstacles that lay ahead. Even if Iron Hawk allowed Sarah to remain permanently with the tribe, their relationship would continue to face challenges from both communities. There would always be those on both sides who saw their connection as betrayal or contamination. The practical difficulties of building a life together in a world torn by conflict would be enormous. Yet as they talked through the night, both Sarah and Running Wolf found themselves believing that the love growing between them was strong enough to overcome these obstacles. They had already proven that understanding and respect could bridge the gap between their cultures. Perhaps their relationship could serve as an example of what was possible when people chose to see beyond surface differences to recognize their shared humanity. The approaching end of Iron Hawk's trial period would force them to make choices that would determine not only their personal futures, but also their roles in the larger story unfolding between their peoples. The season of learning and growing was ending, but the real test of everything they had built together was just beginning. The decisions they made in the coming days would echo through both their lives and potentially through the history of two cultures struggling to find ways to coexist in a changing world. The morning of Iron Hawk's final decision dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline air that made the Texas Hill Country seem to stretch endlessly in all directions. Sarah McKenna stood outside her lodge, watching the sun rise over a landscape that had become as familiar to her as the rolling farmland of her childhood. In the 10 months since her capture, this Comanche camp had become home in ways she never could have imagined, but today would determine whether that home would remain hers or whether she would face an uncertain future in a world where she no longer belonged to either culture. Running Wolf had spent the night in meditation and prayer, seeking guidance from the spirits who he believed had brought Sarah into his life for purposes he was only beginning to understand. The young war chief had changed profoundly during the months of her trial period, not just in his feelings for her, but in his understanding of what leadership meant in a changing world. He had come to believe that the future of his people lay not in endless conflict, but in finding ways to build bridges between cultures while maintaining their essential identity and independence. Iron Hawk himself had used the night hours to consider all the factors that would influence his decision. The chief had watched Sarah's integration into the tribe with growing amazement. Never before had he seen a captive adapt so completely to Comanche ways while retaining the essential qualities that made her valuable as a bridge between worlds. Her presence had strengthened rather than weakened tribal unity, and her insights had proved valuable in understanding the challenges they faced from the advancing white civilization. When the moment for the chief's announcement finally arrived, the entire camp gathered in the same circle where Sarah had first been presented for sale almost a year earlier. The contrast between that moment and this one could not have been more stark. Then, she had stood bound and blindfolded, a commodity to be evaluated and purchased. Now, she stood as an accepted member of the community, awaiting a decision that would determine her future, but confident in her worth regardless of the outcome. Ironhawk's announcement was both simpler and more complex than anyone had expected. He declared that Sarah McKenna had not only proven herself worthy of permanent acceptance into the tribe, but had also demonstrated qualities that made her valuable as a counselor and bridge builder between cultures. However, her permanent status would depend on her willingness to accept responsibilities that went far beyond those of an ordinary tribal member. The chief explained that he was offering Sarah a choice between two very different futures. She could remain with the tribe as Running Wolf's wife, accepting all the privileges and responsibilities that came with that position. In this role, she would be expected to help guide the tribe through the challenges of dealing with the advancing white civilization, using her knowledge of both worlds to help find paths toward peace and coexistence. Alternatively, she could choose to return to the white world, carrying with her the knowledge and understanding she had gained during her time with the Comanche people. In this case, she would serve as an unofficial ambassador, working to educate white communities about the true nature of Comanche culture and the possibilities for peaceful coexistence. Ironhawk made it clear that this choice would be entirely hers, with no pressure from the tribe regardless of what decision she made. The choice Ironhawk presented was more complex than it might have seemed to outside observers. Sarah had indeed fallen deeply in love with Running Wolf, and the thought of a life with him filled her with joy and anticipation. But she also understood the enormous responsibilities that would come with being the wife of a war chief, especially one who was increasingly seen as a bridge between cultures. Her decisions would affect not only her own happiness but the welfare of the entire tribe. Running Wolf waited for Sarah's response, with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Over the months of their growing relationship, they had talked extensively about the challenges they would face if they chose to build a life together. There would be those in both communities who would see their union as betrayal or contamination. Their children would belong fully to neither world while potentially serving as bridges between both. The practical difficulties of maintaining their relationship in a time of ongoing conflict would be enormous. But Running Wolf had also come to understand that love of the kind they shared was rare and precious, something that transcended the artificial boundaries created by cultural conflict. He believed that their relationship could serve as an example of what was possible when people chose to see beyond surface differences to recognize their shared humanity. More than personal happiness, their union could contribute to the larger cause of peace between their peoples. Sarah's response, when it finally came, reflected the wisdom and strength she had developed during her months with the tribe. She announced that she chose to remain with the Comanche people as Running Wolf's wife, but she also requested permission to maintain connections with the white world that would allow her to serve as a bridge between cultures. She envisioned a role that would involve traveling between communities, carrying messages of understanding, and working to create opportunities for peaceful dialogue. Ironhawk's acceptance of Sarah's counterproposal marked the beginning of a new chapter, not just in her life and Running Wolf's, but in the tribe's approach to dealing with the changing world around them. The chief recognized that the old ways of pure resistance were becoming less viable as white settlement continued to advance. Having someone who could navigate both worlds while maintaining loyalty to Comanche values might provide opportunities for survival and adaptation that pure military resistance could not achieve. The wedding ceremony that followed was unlike any that had ever been performed in the tribe's history. Sarah and Running Wolf were joined not just as individuals choosing to share their lives, but as symbols of the possibility for understanding between cultures. The ceremony itself blended traditional Comanche customs with elements that acknowledged Sarah's white heritage, creating something new that honored both traditions without betraying either. The celebration that followed the ceremony lasted for 3 days, with visitors arriving from other Comanche bands and even representatives from allied tribes who had heard about the unusual union taking place. Sarah found herself at the center of attention not as a curiosity, but as someone who had earned respect through her actions and character. The support she received from the broader community validated the choices both she and Running Wolf had made. But the real test of their union came in the months that followed, as they worked together to fulfill the vision Sarah had outlined in her response to Ironhawk. They began making carefully planned visits to white settlements, initially to communities where Sarah had family connections, but gradually expanding to include towns and military posts where their message might have strategic value. These missions were dangerous for both of them, requiring careful planning and often relying on contacts in both communities who believed in the possibility of peace. Running Wolf risked being seen as a traitor by more militant members of his own people, while Sarah faced suspicion from whites who couldn't understand why she would choose to remain with her former captors. But their combined efforts began to create small pockets of understanding that offered hope for broader change. The couple's first child was born during the second spring of their marriage. a daughter whose mixed heritage seemed to embody the possibilities they were working to create. Little Star, as she was named, grew up fluent in both languages and comfortable in both cultures, moving easily between the Comanche camp and the white settlements where her parents conducted their diplomatic work. As the years passed, Sarah and Running Wolf's efforts began to bear fruit in ways neither had initially imagined. Their work contributed to several successful negotiations between tribal leaders and military commanders, preventing conflicts that might have cost many lives on both sides. More importantly, they helped establish a network of relationships between individuals on both sides who were committed to finding alternatives to violence and warfare. The couple faced personal challenges as well as public ones during these years. There were times when the pressures of their unique position threatened to overwhelm their relationship. The constant travel, the political tensions, and the criticism from extremists on both sides created strains that tested their love and commitment. But they had learned during their first months together that their relationship was strong enough to overcome obstacles that might defeat couples with less understanding and mutual respect. Their second child, a son named Bridge Walker, was born during a particularly difficult period when tensions between Comanche bands and military forces were escalating toward what seemed like inevitable warfare. Sarah and Running Wolf's diplomatic efforts became even more crucial during this time, as they worked frantically to create opportunities for dialogue before violence could spiral out of control. The success they achieved in helping to negotiate a temporary peace agreement that prevented a major military campaign marked the culmination of their years of bridge-building work. The agreement wasn't perfect, and it didn't resolve all the underlying tensions between the cultures, but it demonstrated that alternatives to warfare were possible when people of goodwill on both sides were willing to work for understanding. As Sarah and Running Wolf entered their middle years, they began to see the long-term impact of the choices they had made on that morning when Iron Hawk offered her a decision about her future. Their children were growing up to be natural diplomats and bridge builders, carrying forward the work their parents had begun. Other couples, inspired by their example, were beginning to form similar relationships that crossed cultural boundaries. The love story that had begun when a blindfold fell away in a Comanche camp had evolved into something far larger than either Sarah or Running Wolf had initially imagined. Their relationship had become a symbol of hope and possibility, proving that understanding and respect could overcome even the deepest cultural divisions. More than a personal romance, their union had contributed to a gradual transformation in how members of both cultures thought about the possibilities for coexistence. Looking back on the journey that had brought them from that first moment of recognition to their current life as respected leaders in the cause of peace, both Sarah and Running Wolf understood that their love had indeed conquered more than just the obstacles to their personal happiness. It had conquered the prejudices and fears that had seemed to make their relationship impossible, and in doing so, it had opened doors for others to follow. The woman who had once been sold blindfolded as a commodity had become one of the most important peacemakers of her generation. The warrior who had fallen to his knees at the sight of her face had discovered that true strength lay not in warfare, but in the courage to build bridges between enemies. Together, they had proven that love, understanding, and mutual respect could triumph over hatred, fear, and prejudice. Their story became legend in both communities, told and retold as an example of what was possible when people chose to see beyond surface differences to recognize their shared humanity. The blindfold that had hidden Sarah's face during the darkest moment of her life had become a symbol of the barriers that prevented understanding between cultures. When that blindfold fell away, it revealed not just a beautiful woman but the possibility for a different kind of relationship between peoples who had been taught to see each other as enemies. In the end, Sarah McKenna and Running Wolf's love story was about more than just two individuals who found each other across the divide of cultural conflict. It was about the power of love to transform not just the people who experience it, but the world around them. Their relationship became a bridge that allowed others to cross between worlds that had seemed forever separated, proving that even in the darkest of times, love truly could conquer all.